Hello, the paper is Development, Globalization and Society, and this module is about Microcredit Program, a celebrated social security policy. In today's module, we are going to talk about changing orientation on social security policy, and we will see if microcredit as an institutionalized model for providing social security and how does it behave under a neoliberal program. This module focuses on issues like microcredit program as a prize example of social security measures undertaken and institutionalized by a neoliberal state. Debate situated within the discourse on globalization and neoliberal economic paradigm. We would also have a look at change in the orientation of the state, change in the perspective of social security policies, and microfinance as a legitimized social security policy. Globalization has legitimized neoliberalism as a dominant economic paradigm. Such a paradigm shifts the role of the state, predominates market as a prime mover of the society, and dilutes social security and welfare policies. Neoliberalism is a political economic model dedicated to the absolute rule of the market and to the dismantling of the welfare state. The neoliberal policy has attacked the very foundation of the social security and welfare. Powerful economic institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank imposed their neoliberal agenda on heavily indebted developing countries in return for the much needed loan. Both in the developed and developing country, state-made cuts were made to the welfare benefit that had prevented many poorer families from sinking into further destitution. The neoliberal assumption that the informal sector could provide a safety net to the unemployed became more absurd, given that hundreds and thousands of informal workers were losing their jobs while the wages of the others were pushed down to the level of starvation. Instead, there was a growth of informalization and destitution. Now let's try and understand the various dimensions of neoliberalism. Firstly, it is propounded on the ideology of consumerist free market. The codifiers of neoliberalism are global power elite. They serve as the chief advocates of neoliberals. They flood the public discourse with idealized image of a consumerist free market world. Secondly is the neoliberal governance model, where there is a primacy of free market, and it is hoped that that would serve as the model for the governance too. It is based on entrepreneurial values such as competitiveness, self-interest, and decentralization. It promotes individual empowerment and the devolution of central state power to smaller localized units. The neoliberal mode of governance redefines citizens as customer or clients and encourage administrators to cultivate an entrepreneurial spirit. At the third level, it is a policy package involving a set of three core policies, which is deregulation of the economy, number one, liberalization of trade, number two, and privatization of state-owned enterprises. In this context, some of the policy measures include massive reduction of social welfare services. The neoliberal policies also leads to rising inequality and poverty. Let's argue and understand how. The proponents of this view argue that increased economic growth benefits the entire nation and eventually will trickle down to the lower strata of this society. But actually, this doesn't seem to be happening. But economists and social scientists like Steger and Roy, Bhagwati, Ahluwalia and Little argue that the positive outcome of India's comprehensible reform include massive economic growth, exchange rate stability, substantial increase in foreign direct investment. True, these things have happened since we have joined the bandwagon of LPG. They believe that agriculture will become more efficient and competitive with greater and efficient use of resources. Notwithstanding such explanation, a vast literature of empirical data suggests that the structural adjustment program of the IMF and the World Bank have led to economic hardship. The studies are done by Goldberg and Pavnik, Hilson and Potter. The neoliberal reform have increased the gap between the rich and the poor and have also exposed the country to the devastating impact of the current global financial crisis. It is very clear that economic growth has not necessarily brought about equitable distribution of wealth across population. Rather, it has led to growing inequality. One needs to recognize that there are groups of people of particular caste, class, race, ethnicity, sexuality, and gender who are discriminated because of their disadvantaged position within the social structure. Poverty is also a gendered experience. Women have become the ideal flexible worker of the new global economy, which indicates that it is because they are prepared to be flexible to comply with family duties in the lower paid occupation with little security or bargaining power. Poverty becomes not an issue of structural inequality, but a matter of individual inefficiency. Thus, the neoliberal development agenda ignores the existing power relationship within the community. Additionally, preferences of notion of social capital ignores power and the local people. That is, the citizens are now primarily understood and recognized as economic, rational consumers. So what is the rationale of social security policy within the neoliberal state? Let's try and understand this. Social security policies within neoliberal paradigm is both pro-market and pro-poor. Their social security policies embody values of pro-market norms couched in pro-poor terminology. The first argument is that investing in human capital, the language of social security policies recasts social spending as investing in a kind of capital. So the investment is not for the welfare of the poor, but the logic of investment is to make them productive. The second line of argument is that an income support will enable the poor to behave as a proper neoliberal subject, as entrepreneurs and risk takers. The idea is that supporting the poor in terms of income would make them empowered to take risks needed to break out of the poverty cycle. The third idea that strengthens the neoliberal agenda is the move towards normalizing the exploitative market condition. The social security support is to be understood not as a temporary relief, but as a means of enhancing production by entrepreneurial activity. Thus, in the present scenario, informality is accepted and celebrated. Let's move on and try and understand what do we mean by the term microfinance. The term microfinance refers to credit, loan, saving, insurance, transfer services, and other financial products targeted at low-income clients. The term microcredit, commonly used, meaning microcredit disbursed mainly by the private sector, including non-governmental organizations. The World Bank, the USAID, and the DFID hold that microfinance-based programs constitute the single most development intervention that can be universally adapted as the most effective weapon against poverty. Statistics on microcredit reveal that it has a massive outreach among poor women all over the world. Self-employment is the key towards ensuring growth in informal sector, and ventures based on self-employment to be successful need supports in terms of initial funding as capital. Women groups have identified credit as a major constraint in their work with poor in general and informal sector women work in particular. Post-1980s, one can perceive a pressure on the state and the non-government organization to form groups of women credit purposes. This has been termed as microfinance movement. Let's understand what are the constraints which has when it comes to access to credit. It is argued that the poor as a category is a high-risk, high-cost proposition which makes banks wary of lending to the poor. The credit constraint experienced by the poor reflect the fact that poverty, insecurity, and vulnerability are interrelated concepts, and that any intervention to alleviate poverty should be able to address increasing insecurity and vulnerability faced by the poor. Poors were mostly employed in the informal or unorganized sector with low-paying, temporary, insecure job and high working hour, which do not lend them credibility. Uncertainty about the earning of the poor led to the uncertainty regarding their payment of the loan amount, leading to default. Poor have irregular and volatile income and expenditure streams, which make them major debt risk. What had invariable happened is that traditionally, the poverty measures have captured the state of deprivation of the poor, but have invariably failed to address their insecurity and vulnerability. Further, this constraint gets intensified for poor women because they are considered to be least credit worthy. Let's try and understand the public-private partnership model. The model runs on the logic that state is inefficient and corrupt, whereas civil society organizations in the form of NGOs and corporate houses are not only efficient but also non-corrupt. The fallout of such a policy model is that it nowhere addresses the structural components of poverty, making poverty is a solely individual enterprise. Such a policy has two important implications. One, it starts perceiving citizens as clients and consumers, and two, a dilution of accountability. This provided the rationale to develop a model public-private partnership where non-government organizations and corporate houses link with the state through the corporate social responsibility program, or they on their own start providing to citizens access to essential services such as health, education, water, agriculture extension activities, and credit. This model is based on the dual logic, which associates state with inefficiency and private organizations as efficient. Within a neoliberal state, one cannot hold a non-state actor providing access to services to the accountable to the people. The discourse of the microfinance is based on making the poor accountable for their poverty. Academic research on microfinance has two very distinct positions. One group of scholars perceive the program as bringing down the levels of poverty and facilitating women empowerment. Others question the above claim and argue that cost of such intervention is truly huge. What is the ideology of the microcredit program? Ideologically, microcredit programs are market-based programs that focus on the individual enterprising nature. Hanek and Joseph, World Bank, and other international aid agencies portray poverty as a locally and individually created and therefore a locally and individually solvable problem. In this regard, microcredit that helps to raise household income in monetary terms falls perfectly in line with such an approach. Microcredit thus creates an image of poor who themselves would work their way out of poverty. In this sense, one has to understand that successful microcredit programs are essentially business strategies that worked. It is premised on the ground that welfare programs that provided resources without making the poor work for are not an efficient way of addressing poverty. Rather, one has to make the poor accountable for their poverty. The review of literature on microcredit primarily is of two types. There is a positive evaluation and there is a negative evaluation. Let's understand what are the positive evaluation. The main idea is that the program elevates poverty and leads to women empowerment. But the negative evaluation is feminists have critiqued microcredit program on the ground that it has not really led to women empowerment and decrease in actual poverty level. One position positively evaluates the program and emphasizes its role in elevating poverty and leading to women's empowerment. The second position put forth by feminists have critiqued microcredit program on the ground that it has not really led to women's empowerment and the issue is far from resolved. The business approach to the elevation of poverty. This situates very well the argument that the pro-poor policy of social security emphasized as in microcredit is very much a pro-market strategy to integrate the marginalized poor women into the market on disadvantageous terms and conditions. Legitimization of microcredit. The United Nations declared 2005 as the year of microcredit and Nobel Peace Prize 2006 been awarded to Muhammad Yunus and his Grameen Bank of Bangladesh. This was translated into a massive investment in this sector in the form of grants, projects, conferences, workshops, and many other activities in order to encourage and facilitate the growth of this program. Specifically, these organizations have been able to design structures and procedures that enable them to run efficient banking, such as providing financial services that match their client need, keeping transaction costs low, minimizing the leakage of funds through loan default or the misappropriation of the money by the staff. Thus, one has to realize that good repayment rates are the result of social and institutional pressure rather than the benign sounding social collateral as it is projected by international and national microcredit and funding organizations. What is the design of a microcredit program? Let's try and understand it. The notion of the profit is ingrained within the program. It is a resource-creating program that ensures that banking institutions make profits. The organizers charge exorbitant rate of interest, almost an average of 24 to 25% per annum. NABARD provides refinance to commercial bank at 7.5% per annum. Banks on lend to NGOs at 10 to 15%. NGOs and lend to SHGs at 12 to 24%, and groups lend to individual members at 24 to 26% per annum. Microcredit enterprise will have to generate very high rates of profit and return to be sustainable to the borrower. In this neoliberal times, the transfer of the task of serving the credit needs of rural borrower from the banking system to the NGO-controlled microcredit project does not reduce transaction cost, but in effect transfers transaction cost, higher transaction cost to the donors as well as to the borrowers. Assumptions regarding women within the microcredit program. An image of women as an ideal, dutiful, hardworking, resourceful, responsible and efficient is painted who smilingly carry the burden of the family, community and the nation. Microcredit program assume that all women are budding entrepreneur. Women are expected to be responsible, bear the burden of the family, household, and community without complaining. Institutionalizing of the informal sector, where high productivity is possible with low capital cost, which make women work in exploitative working condition and puts the burden of failure on the shoulders. Women are viewed as an instrument for development rather than microcredit program being seen as a liberatory process for her. Financial market per se cannot adequately address the structural aspects of intra-household relation, social and cultural norm that influence integration and exclusion of women, gender, division of labor, gender distribution of load, resources, and responsibilities. In a neoliberal state, let's sum up, in a neoliberal state, social security measures are also market-based. In this regard, the formation of self-help groups of women to access microcredit can be viewed as a strategy to bring people into the market and organize them so as to control them. It is believed that the poor, especially poor women, as they are efficient manager and industrious worker with access to small amounts of capital, would be converted into independent and productive members in the market. Thus, microfinance programs that are primarily engaged in the promotion of small-scale enterprises have an obvious appeal in an era characterized by the strength of the neoliberal ideas about the benefits of the market and the private enterprise. Thank you.